The former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been sentenced to 5 years in prison after being found guilty of criminal conspiracy by a Paris court. The case was related to millions of euros of illicit funds from the late Libyan leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi.
They called Africans corrupt. They called them lawless. They called them unfit to govern themselves. But look who's in handcuffs now. The same man who bombed Libya in the name of justice is now begging for it in a Paris courtroom. The same voice that once lectured Africa on democracy has been silenced by the echo of his own crimes. Sarkozy isn't just falling. He's proof that the empire rots from within. And for every African they buried under their lies, tonight, history digs one up. Let's get into it. Paris woke up today to the sound of its own hypocrisy cracking. The marble floors of the Palais de Justice no longer gleamed with moral superiority. They echoed with the footsteps of a disgraced emperor. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy, once the self-proclaimed reformer of modern France, now wears the title of convicted criminal. 5 years in prison, a €100,000 fine, and a 5-year ban from public office. That's not a rumor. That's the official decree of a Paris criminal court, the same city that once crowned him a savior, now spelling out his disgrace in black and white. For decades, Sarkozy strutted through African capitals as a missionary of democracy, wagging his finger at leaders he called corrupt or unfit. He lectured us about rule of law, about transparency, about civilized governance. Yet here he stands, condemned by his own judges for criminal conspiracy. Not rumor, not politics, law. The courtroom scene could have been lifted from a Greek tragedy. As the verdict was read, the man who once ordered bombs to fall over Tripoli sat frozen. Not a word, not a smile. Just that infamous jawline tightening under the weight of history. His lawyers tried to spin it. Politically motivated, they claimed, a witch hunt. But no amount of polished French can soften the blow that a former president is now a convicted conspirator, accused of cutting deals with Muammar Gaddafi's regime to fund his 2007 election campaign. To the Western press, this is a scandal. To Africa, it's justice wearing French robes. Because when Sarkozy fell, something poetic happened. France's mask slipped. The country that claimed to civilize others must now admit that corruption doesn't start in African palaces. It starts in European ones. For years, they exported good governance workshops, while importing African money to grease their political wheels. Gaddafi's alleged millions, the very lifeblood of Libya's oil wealth, may have fueled the campaign that put Sarkozy in power. If that's not colonial irony, what is? The French establishment calls it a moment of reckoning. But for Africans, it's a moment of exposure. The empire that framed itself as the torchbearer of morality is now burning from within. This isn't merely a case of personal corruption, it's institutional rot surfacing in a courtroom where truth was never meant to reach daylight. And yet, the irony doesn't end there. Sarkozy's sentence isn't just a legal footnote, it's a political earthquake. France's post-colonial machinery, the polished diplomats, the think tankers, the arms dealers, all whisper the same question in private. If the system can devour Sarkozy, who's safe? For Africa, the laughter isn't cruel, it's cathartic. Because for every lecture on African dysfunction, here stands the proof that the dysfunction was global, just better dressed. The handcuffed man once carried Europe's arrogance like a badge. Now he carries its guilt like a shadow. And while he plans his appeal, the world watches as the supposed architect of justice pleads for mercy from the same system he weaponized against others. But justice, like history, has a dark sense of humor. The man who bombed Libya in 2011 in the name of democracy now finds himself buried under the rubble of his own deceit. It's almost too perfect, the empire finally tasting its own medicine. Still, beneath the schadenfreude lies a bigger question, one France doesn't want asked, and Africa won't stop asking. How did the relationship between Sarkozy and Gaddafi even begin? How did a so-called Western reformer end up entangled with the man they later branded a dictator? To understand Sarkozy's fall, you have to start in the desert, not the courtroom. The year was 2007, and Libya's leader Muammar Gaddafi was trying to reinvent himself. After decades of being the West's favorite villain, He had begun opening the country's oil taps to Europe and dismantling his weapons programs. In return, all he wanted was legitimacy, a seat at the table he'd long been banned from. Enter Nicolas Sarkozy, a man hungry for power and willing to shake any hand to get it. His campaign coffers were running dry, his political momentum uncertain. Gaddafi saw an opportunity: support a future French president, and Libya could finally buy its way out of isolation. It wasn't friendship, it was business, power, and theater, each man pretending to believe the other's sincerity. Behind closed doors, intermediaries began to move. French intelligence officers, Libyan ministers, and corporate fixers started arranging meetings that would never appear in the official archives. Reports later described suitcases of cash, transfers routed through offshore accounts, and personal visits by senior Sarkozy aides to Tripoli. The sums discussed ranged from 5 million euros to over 50 million euros, enough to tilt an election and secure France's new African partnership. When the deal was struck, Gaddafi believed he had bought more than influence. He had bought protection. In his eyes, Sarkozy was an ally, someone who would defend Libya's sovereignty while rebranding its image abroad. And at first that illusion worked. In 2007, Sarkozy invited Gaddafi to Paris for a 5-day state visit that still haunts France's collective memory. The Libyan leader pitched his Bedouin tent in the heart of Paris, brought his golden entourage, and shook hands with French elites under the Eiffel Tower. To many in France, it was an embarrassment. To Gaddafi, it was victory, the conqueror's return. And for a brief, dangerous moment, it seemed as though Africa and Europe had rewritten the rules. But power loves betrayal. Within 4 years, Sarkozy turned his back on the very man who had helped lift him into the Élysée Palace. By 2011, Libya had become the West's next humanitarian crisis. NATO jets began pounding Tripoli, and France, led by Sarkozy, became one of the loudest voices calling for Gaddafi's removal. The man once hosted as a guest of honor was now branded a tyrant, and his country was torn apart in the name of freedom. Why did Sarkozy flip? Some say it was ideology, others say politics, but the truth lies deeper. By 2010, whispers of the Libyan financing deal were starting to surface. Leaked documents, defectors, and journalists were hinting that Sarkozy's campaign had been fueled by African oil money. The simplest way to erase a scandal? Erase its source. And so, Libya burned. When Gaddafi was hunted down and killed in Sirte, Sarkozy appeared before cameras, celebrating the triumph of democracy. What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that the man bleeding in that desert had once bankrolled his political rise. This wasn't just hypocrisy. It was strategic erasure. The French president who claimed to liberate Libya was, in truth, liberating himself from the evidence of his own corruption. But history keeps receipts. The networks that moved that money didn't disappear with Gaddafi's death. They simply went quiet. The intermediaries, the shell companies, the secret accounts, all of it stayed buried under the same soil NATO bombed. And that's where the real rot hides. Because this wasn't a one-off scandal. It was part of a system, a web of power that links French politics to African resources in ways no one dares to speak of. So if Sarkozy was just one player in a much bigger machine, then the question isn't how he fell. It's how many more are still standing on the same stolen foundation. That's the truth France fears most, and that's what takes us straight into the next part of this story. The secret empire beneath the handshake, France-Afrique. Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Born in the ashes of decolonization, France-Afrique was supposed to be dead by the 1980s. Officially, France had granted independence to its African colonies. But what came next wasn't liberation, it was redesign. Paris simply switched uniforms. Instead of generals and governors, it sent bankers, diplomats, and development experts. Instead of muskets, it used money. And the chain that once rattled visibly around Africa's neck was now polished into something called partnership. At its heart, France-Afrique was built on 3 pillars: finance, resources, and politics. The financial arm moved through French commercial banks and off-the-books funding networks. African nations were persuaded or coerced to keep their foreign reserves in the French treasury, a policy that gave Paris direct control over billions in African wealth. The resource arm ran through multinationals like Total Energies, Areva, and Bolloré, whose profits depended on African oil, uranium, and transport corridors. And the political arm? That was the velvet glove. Quiet support for regimes that stayed loyal, silent sabotage for those that didn't. Sarkozy didn't invent this system. He inherited it. When he walked into the Élysée Palace, Françafrique was already a living organism, breathing through embassies, contracts, and corporate boardrooms. He simply learned how to feed it, and, as Libya proved, how to weaponize it. Every deal had a hidden clause, every visit a hidden cost. French influence wasn't about diplomacy, it was about maintenance, keeping the empire alive without calling it an empire. In countries like Chad, Niger, and Gabon, French advisors practically wrote the budgets. French troops trained local armies but doubled as protectors of French assets. African presidents who complied were rewarded with investment and media approval. Those who refused were branded unstable, isolated, or replaced under the pretext of humanitarian intervention. And then came Libya, the jewel that was never supposed to be touched by this invisible empire. Gaddafi was too rich, too independent, too unpredictable. He funded African projects outside French channels, from telecommunications to a pan-African currency plan that threatened to break the CFA franc system, a system that had kept Africa's money under Paris's control for half a century. If that currency succeeded, France's economic umbilical cord to Africa would snap overnight. That's why Libya mattered. It wasn't just about oil, it was about the survival of Françafrique itself. Sarkozy's turn against Gaddafi in 2011 wasn't an act of conscience, it was a purge. Libya's independence had become dangerous, and Paris needed to send a message to the rest of Africa: defy us, and we'll make you a warning. Yet in the years since, that warning has lost its power. The empire is fraying. African nations are finally tearing up military deals, reclaiming mines, and rejecting the CFA system. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have expelled French troops, replacing them with homegrown alliances and regional cooperation. What once hid behind polished French suits now stands naked in the sunlight, a power structure collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. And that's the irony. Sarkozy's conviction didn't just humiliate a former president, it exposed an entire generation of French elites who believed they could forever feed off African wealth while preaching virtue. The courtroom might have judged one man, but the real trial is happening in African hearts, a verdict on a century of deceit. Now, as the dust settles over Paris, the ripples move outward. Europe's leaders are watching. They see a system unraveling and wonder if their own foundations are next. Because if Françafrique can be dragged into the light, so can its Western cousins. Which leads to the next question, and it's the one every capital in Europe now fears to ask: what happens when the empire starts eating its own? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When the first gavel struck in Paris, the echo didn't stop at the Seine. It rattled through Brussels, London, and Washington. What happened in that French courtroom wasn't just a national embarrassment. It was the sound of the Western establishment devouring one of its own, and realizing too late that the disease they diagnosed in others has been festering in their own bloodstream all along. For decades, Europe has worn the robe of righteousness, pretending its corruption was cleaner, more civilized. When African leaders were accused of misusing funds, European politicians wagged their fingers. When Western governments brokered shady oil deals or armed dictatorships, they called it diplomacy. But Sarkozy's conviction tore through that illusion like a blade through silk. Because suddenly, the scandal wasn't in Africa. It was in Paris, the capital, that the handbook on moral lectures was written. Inside the European Union, the mood is uneasy. Diplomats who once dismissed the case as ancient history are now quietly terrified. Sarkozy's fall is a legal precedent, a blueprint that could haunt them all. If prosecutors can prove that a sitting Western president took money from an African leader to win an election, and then punished that same leader with war, what other skeletons might be unearthed? In Berlin, whispers circulate about corporate lobbying in Africa's energy markets. In Rome, questions rise over Italy's Libyan oil concessions. Even in London, where politicians have long profited from African mineral contracts through private intermediaries, the headlines from Paris feel uncomfortably close to home. The unspoken truth is this: Europe's moral high ground has turned into quicksand, and the cracks are showing everywhere. The European Parliament is still reeling from its own bribery scandal involving foreign cash, the so-called Qatargate. Brussels officials were caught laundering influence through luxury trips and hidden payments. It's the same disease, only dressed in better suits. Sarkozy's conviction adds a face, a legacy, and a terrifying precedent to that sickness. The West now faces a mirror it can't look away from. The story it sold to the world of democracy, law, and ethics is now stained with the fingerprints of its own greed. The empire is punishing itself, not out of integrity, but out of necessity. Because if the illusion of moral superiority dies, so does its power to control others. And make no mistake, this isn't just France's embarrassment, it's Europe's unraveling. For decades, Western media crafted a narrative where corruption was African, insurgency was Middle Eastern, and arrogance was Russian or Chinese. But now, the same media must explain why one of Europe's most powerful leaders stands convicted for the very crimes he accused others of. Even within France, this ruling has sent shockwaves through the political class. If Sarkozy, the golden boy of conservative politics, can be branded the next criminal, who's next? Former presidents François Hollande and Emmanuel Macron both governed amid controversial contracts with African states and Gulf monarchies. Their advisors are watching Sarkozy's case like men counting minutes before the flood. It's not justice that scares them, it's exposure. Because once Europe's own corruption becomes undeniable, the entire moral infrastructure collapses. Every lecture, every sanction, every anti-corruption summit suddenly reeks of hypocrisy. And as Europe's moral currency devalues, its global influence shrinks. African nations are no longer listening to sermons from the same capitals that once looted them. They're signing defense deals with Russia, infrastructure pacts with China, and trade agreements with each other. The West's authority was built on its reputation. Now that the reputation is bleeding out in a courtroom in Paris. That's why Sarkozy's case is more than a conviction, it's contagion. When one empire bleeds, the others tremble. And if the West begins to lose its moral mandate, then global power itself begins to shift. Which brings us to the final question, the one that defines this whole story. What does Sarkozy's fall mean for Africa, the continent that endured his wars, his arrogance, and now watches his humiliation with unblinking eyes? When Sarkozy's verdict was read, the sound of justice in Paris carried all the way across the Sahara. It wasn't just a sentence, it was an echo. For decades, Africa had been the courtroom where France played judge and jury. But this time, the gavel hit home. The empire that once defined others by corruption has now branded itself with the same stain. And Africa, watching in silence, understood something profound. The circle has closed. This moment isn't about revenge, it's about revelation. Because for the first time in modern memory, the myth of Western moral superiority has cracked wide open. The very leader who preached governance to African nations, who called coups and uprisings signs of uncivilized disorder, has been convicted by his own court for corruption linked to African money. There's poetry in that. But there's also power, the power of truth finally finding its voice. Across the continent, Sarkozy's fall isn't seen as a French scandal, it's seen as a mirror. A reflection of how long Africa was gaslit into believing that it was the student of democracy when, in truth, it was the teacher. One whose lessons were suppressed, its achievements erased, and its leaders executed when they refused to bow. From Lumumba to Sankara to Gaddafi, every African who dared to stand upright was cut down by the same system now collapsing under its own hypocrisy. But something has changed. Africa no longer looks to the West for moral validation. The streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry echo not with submission but with defiance. The new generation no longer dreams of Paris. It builds in Accra, Nairobi, Kigali, and Addis Ababa. The verdict against Sarkozy doesn't inspire shock here. It confirms what the continent has always known, that Europe's morality was never pure, only well-branded. The symbolism runs deeper than politics. In 2011, Sarkozy stood before the cameras celebrating Gaddafi's death, calling it a new dawn for Libya. 14 years later, the roles have reversed. It's not Libya buried under rubble now, it's Sarkozy's legacy. The new dawn he promised has come, but not for France. It's dawning over Africa, as nations rewrite their alliances, reclaim their resources, and refuse to play by colonial rules dressed as partnerships. Because let's be honest, Sarkozy's trial didn't expose Africa's weakness. It exposed France's dependence. The fact that a European president allegedly needed African money to win an election tells the real story. The empire was never self-sufficient. It fed off Africa to sustain its illusion of power. That illusion has finally shattered. And now, as Paris wrestles with its guilt, Africa is finding clarity. It's no longer content being the audience to Europe's morality plays. The continent is writing its own script, one where leaders rise without kneeling, where resources serve the people, not the invaders, and where foreign aid is replaced by equal trade. Sarkozy's cell is symbolic, not because he's behind bars, but because France is. The verdict cages the myth of Western innocence. It's the first time the empire is being judged by its own conscience, and the verdict is guilty. But Africa doesn't need to celebrate his downfall. History already did that. The real victory lies in what comes next. The rebirth of African confidence, the end of the dependency narrative, the rise of a generation unafraid to confront its past and own its future. Because this time, when the West looks south, it won't see a continent waiting for approval. It will see a continent that smiles, not out of forgiveness, but understanding. The same understanding that Sankara spoke of before his death. A soldier without political education is a potential criminal. And now, decades later, the world finally sees the irony. The self-proclaimed defenders of democracy were the ones without education. Africa has learned, the West has not, and that's why the future no longer speaks French, it speaks freedom. Do you think Sarkozy's fall is justice or just the beginning of Europe's reckoning? Let us know in the comment section. Has Africa finally broken the spell of Western moral superiority? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.